Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Welcome back to Gran Turismo Origins. This is the ongoing series where I'm diving into each of the first 6 mainline GT games. In my opinion, these games define what Gran Turismo is, and yet they all differ from each other in many different ways. These videos are my way of making sense of everything as we fully dissect these games. We're covering pretty much every aspect of them, from the menus and music to the fundamental game design. But not only are we looking back at them retrospectively, we're also considering how they were viewed at the time. By doing all of this, hopefully we can gain a deeper understanding on what makes these games tick and how each of them fits into the broader story of this series. Today, we're covering the franchise's second iteration, Gran Turismo 2. Following the unexpected global smash hit that was 1997's Gran Turismo, it came as no surprise when a successor was soon announced. Although it had been known about for a while, Gran Turismo 2 was officially unveiled in February 1999. With this new entry, the team at Polyphony Digital aimed to expand the game in pretty much every way. The headline numbers were more than 400 cars and 20 plus circuit locations, up from 150 and 11 respectively in GT1. And it wasn't just about the numbers themselves, but rather what they represented. There was a very clear intention to appeal more to the international audience, which Kazunori himself summed up perfectly. I made the first Gran Turismo for Japan with mostly Japanese cars. I'm making Gran Turismo 2 for the world. The same was true for the track selection. Where GT1 only featured fictional locations, GT2 would also have circuits based on the roads of Rome and Seattle, as well as the real-life Laguna Seca Raceway. Compared to GT1, where all the real-life testing was done in Japan, for GT2 the Gran Turismo team was able to fly out to the US, and Laguna Seca was one of the places they visited. Dirt courses and therefore rally racing would also make their debut in the game, and whilst drag strips were planned, they were eventually cut prior to release. Fundamentally, the game didn't seem massively different to GT1 in terms of the technical aspects, but instead aimed to offer much more content and things to do, which was still quite ambitious when you think about how GT1 was already considered a massive game for the time. Ultimately, by 1999, the original PlayStation was on the way out, with a successor due imminently in the new millennium. From this perspective, it made more sense for the series to capitalize on its sudden popularity by quickly cranking out a sequel that simply iterated on the first game, and then taking their time with the next entry on all new hardware that offered far more possibilities. After all, Polys, as they were known at the time, did spend 5 years creating GT1 from scratch, so to throw all of that out after just one game would have been kind of wasteful. But this meant that Polyphony were in a race against time to get the game out as soon as they physically could. What was originally planned for a summer 1999 release gradually slipped back, with the game eventually pushed out just before Christmas in North America and Japan, and not until the end of January 2000 in PAL regions. With the Gran Turismo name now established, GT2 came with expectations. Expectations that were only heightened by the delays. Could it still deliver in the same way that GT1 did, whilst making full use of its extra content to elevate the gameplay experience even further? Well, let's find out. Presentation-wise, not much really changed between GT1 and GT2. We're still greeted by the GT mode menu laid out like a map, and the black and orange theming is also retained. Really, the big difference is the music. Unlike GT1, in GT2 the menu music is the same in every region, composed by Isamu Ohira, who only did the Japanese soundtrack in the original game. It's definitely similar to his work from GT1, with some of the songs even being remixes of those, but with a bit more of a funk influence. Whilst I still enjoy the music from the international version of GT1 for how well it pairs with the menu design to give off this darker, almost edgy vibe, all the blaring synth noises do get somewhat headache-inducing after a while. I think the music in GT2 strikes a decent balance, while still giving the game its own unique sound. On the visual front, things are also pretty similar. The graphics, which had turned heads in the original game, were understandably not quite as impressive a couple of years on. The only real enhancements I can notice are the reflections on the cars, which are a bit more pronounced. Although I have to say in some situations they are a little bit distracting, as they often make the cars look super glossy. I think what's interesting to consider is that where GT1 was on the cutting edge of visuals, those same visuals in GT2 had already been surpassed. This was mainly because of Sega getting a head start in the 6th generation of consoles, with racing games on their Dreamcast looking noticeably better than any of the PS1 offerings. But as we all know, graphics don't make a game, hence why we're still playing PS1 games more than 2 decades later, despite them looking like PS1 games. games. Aside from visuals, GT1 had a lot more going for it. The driving simulation was of course a massive draw, and it still is in GT2. Yet again, it's a case of evolution rather than revolution. The handling for the most part is very similar, with some minor improvements. Your car is a lot less likely to start sliding under braking, and the strange bouncing issue which affected certain cars in GT1 is also gone. When it came to making everything feel nice to control, GT2 had a much bigger task than GT1. This is because it had much greater diversity in terms of the cars on offer. You could find a bit of everything, ranging from K cars to vintage muscle, the latest supercars, and even 1000 horsepower hill climb monsters, and yet in GT2 they all feel good to drive. It's really a testament to this physics engine that, with only minor tweaks, it's capable of dealing with so many different types of cars while still making them feel distinctly unique. Of course, the introduction of dirt courses was another test for the physics engine. All in all, the handling here is fine. It just seems like they took the tarmac handling and reduced the level of grip. There isn't a huge amount of detail, the cars kind of feel like they just float over the track surface, but you can still have fun throwing them around the corners and understanding the basics of dirt driving. It's also worth noting that in international versions of GT2, the cars have quite a bit more grip on dirt than the original Japanese version. Much like GT1's arcade mode, this was done as a precaution in case Western audiences found the quote-unquote realistic handling too difficult. I haven't played the Japanese release of GT2, so I can't comment on which version is better. On the soundtrack front, the Japanese version of GT2 again features an entirely original selection of instrumentals courtesy of Masahiro Andoh. In my opinion, these songs are even better than his ones from GT1. Seriously, he did not need to go this hard. As you probably expect by now, in the West, our soundtrack sounded completely different. Unlike the menu music, the darker industrial tone from GT1 is still present in both the NTSC and PAL versions, if slightly diluted with some alt-rock elements. This is easily best showcased with a song that's become almost synonymous with GT2, My Favourite Game by the Cardigans. Now, despite the title and coming from the album literally named Gran Turismo, this song was not actually created for the game. Depending on your own knowledge, you will either already know that, or I've just completely blown your mind. Either way, there's no denying that this song fits really well. Almost too well. This version was only used in the NTSC intro movie, as in PAL regions we instead got an electronic remix of the song. It's fine, but just doesn't have the impact of the original. I'm not really sure why they decided to change it. And of course, over in Japan, Andoh's Moon Over the Castle returned. If I'm being honest, GT2's version of this song is probably my favourite from any game, but if I had to choose my favourite GT2 intro, it still just narrowly loses out to the North American one. Shame about your box art though, that logo has always looked pretty awful to me. So, as we've covered, the biggest goal of GT2 was to take GT1 and expand it in all areas. This is most obvious with the cars and tracks. What was originally planned to be 400 cars and 20 unique tracks ended up ballooning to around 650 cars and 27 tracks. Impressive numbers even today. Back in 1999, this would have been near mind-blowing. Of course, when you consider this massive increase in scope, together with the game being delayed several times, I'm sure these two things were not unrelated. But it was a sacrifice with major benefits. At this point, one car model only took about a week for a single designer to create, meaning that they could be pumped out at an astonishing rate. Alongside the desire to have more international makes represented, another goal was to fulfill players' desires when it came to car ownership. This meant representing a wide variety of cars, ranging from standard commuter models that some players were likely to own in real life, through to machines that they could only dream of having one day. But not only that, because they then had to consider this for 3 different regions: Japan, USA, and Europe. This process is what led to GT2 having such a diverse range of cars. Of course, it still has all the models we expect to see, like Nissan GTRs, Toyota Supras, etc., but beyond that, this game is an absolute treasure trove of fascinating machines, some of which are far better remembered than others. Really, there's way too many to go through, so I'll just pick out a small selection of newcomers to prove my point. Alfa Romeo 145, Celine SR Widebody, Honda Logo, Tommy Kaira ZZS, Dodge Intrepid, Renault Espace F1, Aston Martin DB6, Toyota GT1 road car. We could do this all day. To boil it down to simply how many cars are in this game, to me somewhat misses the point. With GT2, it's all about the depth. To be honest, the only major blind spot in this car list is when it comes to many of the premium European makes, like Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche. However, this wasn't for the lack of effort. Leftover data in the game shows that cars from these brands were originally planned before licensing got in the way. Despite the clear marketing benefits the original Gran Turismo demonstrated, some brands were still reluctant to the idea of their cars appearing alongside normal cars. Presumably they weren't too enthused by the idea of their high-performance models getting blitzed by a souped-up Civic. But even still, Polyphony had a solution. They instead licensed cars from brands that could effectively be stand-ins. Instead of Ferrari, we have Venturi. For Lamborghini, it's Vector, and most famously, Porsche would be dummied out for Roof. Despite their cars being based on Porsche chassis, Roof are considered a unique car maker in their own right, hence their appearance in GT2. It's worth mentioning that as a result of memory card limitations, you can only have a maximum of 100 cars in your garage at a time. Collecting more will require you to have more memory cards. With some 650 models on tap, this really wasn't ideal, but there wasn't much they could really do about it. When considering the circuits, this game once again delivers. There's a clear attempt to increase variety, much like the cars. Laguna Seca Raceway became the first real-world racetrack in the series, but there would also be fictional tracks based on real roads in Rome, Seattle, and even the Swiss town of Grindelwald. Super Speedway was slot underneath Test Course as a smaller oval circuit, and Red Rock Valley offered a unique double oval road course layout. And that's not to forget Midfield Raceway and Apricot Hill, two more conventional circuits that would go on to become staples of the series, and the severely underrated and underutilized Rome Nights. With the introduction of Rally, we obviously need some dirt courses, and the Smoky Mountain and Tahiti-based tracks are here to fill that role. But the most memorable of these has to be Pikes Peak, a small section of the real-life hill climb course that made its so far only official appearance in this game. Again, the sheer variety here speaks for itself, and when you combine this with almost all of the GT1 originals returning, it makes for one hell of a roster. For as much praise as I gave those GT1 tracks, the newcomers in GT2 are a noticeable step up when it comes to scope and ambition. There's plenty of cool ideas here, and most of them are a lot of fun to race on. The only slight disappointment for me are the original dirt tracks, many of which I find a little bit too samey and forgettable. So with GT1, we discussed what makes up the foundations of a Gran Turismo career mode, starting with the fundamental ideas. Of course, we don't need to do that again, because GT2 still follows these basic game design principles in how it sets up its gameplay loop using role-playing elements, like buying cars from dealerships, winning races to earn money and more cars, etc. But the specifics of how GT2 handles these elements in some cases differs massively from its predecessor. Let's start from the beginning. License tests make their return. As one of the more controversial aspects of GT1 back when it released, what changes did Polyphony make in the sequel? Well, where there were previously 3 licenses, each with 8 tests, there are now 6 with 10 each. Yeah, not exactly sure how that was supposed to help with complaints of the licenses being tedious. On the upside, I think these tests are a little bit easier to pass than GT1s, with the bronze times often given quite a bit more leeway than silver or gold. That said, if you are going for golds, you're not going to have an easy time, with certain tests being infamous for the extreme level of precision required to beat them. Something that's unique to GT2 is having special sections of track used only in these tests, and that does help with variety. As we know from GT1, the main purpose of these tests is to teach driving techniques. However, I think they went a bit overboard here. Do we really need 3 tests where all we do is accelerate, then stop, and even a 4th test where we do the same thing but from a rolling start? Yes, I get that they're trying to convey that stopping distances increase with increased speed, but it's just such a monotonous way of doing it. What's important to consider is that a lot of these tests are based on things that Kaz himself learned whilst attending the driving school of former racing driver Takashi Ohira. When we consider these tests with that in mind, they do make sense, since this is the sort of stuff that you would have to learn before taking part in a real race. However, within the realm of a game, a lot of it just feels kind of needless when you know that if you miss a corner, the worst thing that'll happen is that you'll have to restart the race. I feel like these tests were imitated too directly from real life, as with a game you can take more risks and make more mistakes to speed up the learning process. As such, being forced to do some of these tests can just seem dull with no real purpose, and that's an issue not just with GT2, but most other Gran Turismos as well. Still, there is a silver lining, and that's if you have a GT1 save with the B and A licenses completed, you can import this progress into GT2. Anyway, back to the career mode at large. Just like GT1, it's a case of using your limited credits to buy a used car. It's interesting to note that because there are so many more manufacturers in GT2, they each have to be contained in sub-menus labelled cleverly as cities. East City is where you'll find the Japanese cars, and like GT1, this is most likely where you'll be heading. Well, unless you want to start the game with a Fiat 500. But now we can get into the races. So where GT1 was built around each event being a multiple race championship, GT2 does almost the exact opposite. Every event in the GT League and special events has multiple races, but almost all of them are single races. And not only that, but each race has you going up against a unique lineup of opponents filling a different performance bracket. Effectively, even though they're all contained within the same event, each race is like its own separate thing. You can even earn a different prize car from each one. The impact of this is that to begin with, you're going to be jumping from event to event quite often, completing one race here, then one race there, just whatever you can actually do with the cars you have at your disposal. Looking at the career from a broader perspective, the structure is still similar to GT1 in that the end goal is to beat the final championship, the GT World League. Unlocking this requires you to win the other events in the GT League, with the special events section containing the bulk of the rest of the events that are effectively supplemental to your progression, giving you ways to earn more money and prize cards. GT2 also brings an expanded selection of endurance races, as well as the all-new rally events that we'll talk more about later. In terms of the races themselves, again it's a similar story to GT1. Outside of the Enduros, they're reasonably short, and you're up against 5 opponents. Qualifying is no longer present, but as I talked about with GT1, it never really mattered that much anyway. In fact, I'd argue it would have mattered even less in GT2. You see, the AI in this game are very prone to rubber banding, certainly more so than GT1 or any other GT game for that matter. Unless you have a massive pace advantage, they're almost guaranteed to be right on your bumper for the whole race, with the entire field often separated by just a couple of seconds. When combined with the AI being just as oblivious as they were in GT1, and maybe even slightly more erratic, this leads to a very frenetic style of racing. I wouldn't exactly say it's my cup of tea, but if there's one thing you can say about the racing in this game, is that it certainly isn't boring. So, we've established the ways in which the career structure both differs and stays the same as GT1's, but how does that actually affect the way you play through this game? Well, the first thing to note is that to begin with, it's going to take longer to progress. There are a few reasons for this. First is that the nature of completing single races with no championship bonus means you'll be earning less money. At the same time, the prize cards in the early races are often not very good and can't be sold for much cash either. In fact, the Sunday Cup and Clubman Cup, the two entry-level events in this game, don't give you any prize cards, and neither do the events in the GT League. However, as we discussed with GT1, it's not just about getting faster cars, but also building out your collection with more variety that allows you to use them in different events. But there are a few key design choices in GT2 that skews this a bit. Whilst the special events contain a selection of events catering to various different types of cars based on drivetrain, body style, and plenty more, most of them don't have specific requirements for entry outside of a power limit. The events in the GT League are now based around nationality, and even though you'll face opponent cars from that respective country or region, they too have no requirement for you to do the same. This is something that I personally find quite disappointing, since even though there's much more variety in this game, Japanese cars still completely dominate. Most of the prize cars are Japanese, and a lot of the overseas models, particularly from Europe, are really overpriced, since it's all based on a Japanese perspective where European is almost a byword for luxury. This is further emphasized by the fact that none of the international brands have a used dealership where older cars are sold at a reduced price. So not even needing these cars for their respective events is the final nail in the coffin. When playing through this game, most of them are honestly kind of pointless, which is a real shame. Anyway, these factors change things quite a bit. In my video covering GT1, I said, what would be the point in having so many cars if you can beat the game with just one or two? This rhetoric was of course intended to emphasize the importance of the design decisions that direct the player into building a diverse collection of cars, truly one of the cornerstones of this series. But the thing with GT2 is that you can literally beat this game with just one or two cars. Now that on its own isn't a bad thing, but I think what's interesting is just how easy it is to do. With your starting 10,000 credits, you can buy a decent starter car, like an R32 Skyline GTST or a Mark III Supra Turbo. From there, you can use it in various different events, including ones it shouldn't be able to enter, using your winnings to continually upgrade it. Even though these events have power limits to make them more challenging, they're usually pretty reasonable. In that case, it's just a matter of grinding through the GT League events, fully upgrading your car, and then taking on the GT World League. Of course, winning it still requires you to be pretty good at the game, so the alternative method is what a lot of GT2 players end up doing unintentionally. I mentioned that a lot of the prize cars in the early game are kind of bad, and given the lack of requirements for most events, mostly useless too. However, some of them are the complete opposite, and there's no better example of this than the 5th race of the 80s Sports Car Cup. This race can be beaten using your starter car with some minor upgrades, and yet your prize is the Skyline Silhouette Group 5 race car. And from this point, you've basically beaten the game. Even though the power limits restrict you from using this car in every event, the fact that you can now win the tougher races means you'll be earning a lot more money and also more valuable prize cars. In GT2, you can earn prize cars multiple times, and given that most events give you prize cars from just a single race, this leads to some very quick and easy money-making methods. Although the one you're seeing here is the most famous example for its sheer absurdity, there are plenty of other less notable ones. Rather than this being the exception, this is merely the most extreme example of something that seems baked into GT2's career. Even if, like me, you decide to self-impose car restrictions for these events, it still doesn't really change that. In GT2, there's not so much a progression curve, more a progression cliff. And it's strange because GT1 wasn't really like this. For me, it kind of spoils some of the enjoyment of the career, since beyond that, nothing really matters. And if you know basically anything about how this career works, and which prize cars you can get from which events, any semblance of challenge falls apart pretty quickly. However, this is just my perspective, and the beauty of these games is that there's more than just one way to play them. Let's take a break from the career to discuss some other aspects of this game. Now, something I've so far failed to mention is that Gran Turismo 2 was so massive in scale that it had to come on 2 discs, one for GT mode and one for arcade mode. In fact, the first of those was so jam-packed that the intro movie and end credit sequence had to be put on the arcade disc instead. Of course, arcade mode itself is also on that disc, making a return from GT1. Here it functions in pretty much the same way. Cars are broken up into classes, and winning single-player races unlocks more cars and tracks to use. New for GT2 is the ability to drive cars from your GT mode garage as well, and there's even a unique circuit that can only be found here, Motorsportsland. The major difference though is that the cars drive in exactly the same way they do in GT mode. None of that sped up gameplay from GT1. As one of the groundbreaking features of GT1, upgrades and tuning also reappear. As I've already touched on, they still play a pretty crucial role in the career, especially when you consider the power limits. Fundamentally nothing has really changed here, but it's worth mentioning that with the massive increase in cars, there are plenty of new and interesting racing modifications, some taking inspiration from real life, and others being entirely original. Beyond the main career, GT2 introduced one-make races. These are single race events catering to specific types of cars and taking place on a randomly selected track. One strange quirk of GT2 is that none of the races in the main career hub take place on reverse circuit variations. As such, these one-make races, with their random course selection, are likely the only opportunity that you'll get to drive many of these tracks the other way round in GT2. Beyond this detail, they're pretty unremarkable, but still a neat little thing on the side, especially if you already have a car that's eligible. GT2 also brought customization to the series for the first time with the wheel shop. This feature was planned for GT1, but it first appeared here with a modest selection of fully licensed aftermarket wheels. Again, it isn't much, but it's still nice to have. As one of its major new features, you might think it's strange that I haven't talked all that much about Rally, but that's mainly because it doesn't really factor that much into the game. There are a handful of license tests on dirt circuits, which thanks to the increased grip in the international versions are very easy to pass, and also the dirt events in the career. Each event centers around one circuit, with the races getting gradually tougher as you face faster opponents. However, instead of physically racing against that single opponent, you race a ghost car over a single lap, which effectively makes these time trials. You also don't earn prize cars from these events. All of these decisions make Rally kind of forgettable in GT2, since there isn't much incentive to actually do it. However, you would be missing out. GT2 is still the only game to feature the Pikes Peak hill climb, and that gives it a sort of mystique. But personally, I think the best thing about Rally in GT2 is the cars we got for it. There are so many Rally and Rally-inspired models to be found, with the poster child of course being the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak. This is literally the fastest car in the game, and not just on dirt. It's an absolute monster that's since become a part of Gran Turismo folklore, and GT2 was the game that brought it to the series. Now, I'm going to try and say this in the nicest way possible, but GT2 is kinda janky. Arguably the most janky of all the Gran Turismos. Unfortunately, the rush to get the game out for Christmas 1999 took its toll on the quality assurance. The initial release of the game was littered with various bugs affecting completion, AI opponents, collision physics, and even more. For a game that was so anticipated, it really wasn't ideal. To their credit though, Sony acted swiftly, offering replacement discs with a patched version of the game to anyone affected. However, even in the latest versions, we can still see some leftovers from its rushed development. From minor issues, such as a bunch of typos and mistranslations, to things that affect gameplay, such as AI that still break horsepower limits, and even have cars that are upgraded far beyond what we can do as players. However, the thing that's always irked me the most is how many cars just have completely incorrect specs in this game. whether that be concerning their power, weight, or even their drivetrain layouts. Honestly, some of these are so egregiously wrong that I almost think they have to be deliberate. But it doesn't end here, because sometimes the game even straight up lies about their performance, displaying one power figure in the dealership and then an entirely different one in your garage. It's just a total mess. Anyway, regardless of how polished it is, there's no denying that GT2 was a massive game. There's just so much content here that it'll easily keep you entertained for months and maybe even years. With that said, let's now approach the idea of Gran Turismo as a sandbox. For me, there's two main ways to enjoy these games. One is through their structured career, where you work towards the end goal of beating the game, but the second is through a sandbox type experience where there is no structure or goals beyond whatever you personally want to do. The nature of these games is that once you beat the main career and have access to the fastest cars as well as plenty of money, everything you do after that will be in the realm of a sandbox. Bear in mind that when I talk about these games being sandboxes, that's not 100% true, because you're never just given all the content at some point. You still need to earn money to buy cars and upgrades, or win certain prize cars from races. I guess it would be more accurate to call them restricted sandboxes. Anyway, I think this is a concept that's fairly easy to understand, and generally how much of each style of experience you want in a game will determine how much you enjoy it. For example, let's look at Gran Turismo 7. The main structured career is frankly a waste of time, but in spite of that, plenty of people still play this game. Why is that? Well, they're obviously not starting a new save every time they boot up the game. Despite what anyone may say, there's no denying that GT7 is a pretty decent sandbox. There's plenty of cars, tracks, and features to mess around with, so long as you have the impetus to come up with your own goals or challenges. This is why, despite the fact I place a lot more stock in these games as structured single-player experiences, I still boot up GT7 every once in a while to enjoy it as an automotive sandbox, before I inevitably get bored. However, the true beauty of these older Gran Turismos is that they can be compelling structured games, but also enjoyable sandboxes at the same time, depending on how you play them. For instance, I'm fairly certain there are at least a few of you watching this video who've sunk hundreds of hours into at least one of these games without any intention of actually beating it. So if we apply this idea to GT2, that completely changes how we look at things. Even though I think that as a structured game it's lacking in some ways, as a sandbox, GT2 is outstanding. There are just so many interesting cars, so many great tracks, and so many events to race them in that you'll almost never get bored. When I talked about the sequels, in particular GT2, making the original game obsolete, this is probably the area where that's the most obvious. And this perspective also changes how we view certain design decisions, because now, being able to win a fast race car from a fairly easy event isn't just a strange design decision that breaks the career and renders any sense of challenge meaningless, it's now a gateway into being able to enjoy the game exactly how you want to. This is why merely saying it has a good career about these older GT games doesn't really tell you the full story, because I may say that GT2's career is decent but a bit unbalanced and not that well thought out thanks to certain design decisions, but someone else may say that GT2's career is close to perfection in part thanks to those very same decisions. And based on their own perspective and what they want from the game, they're not wrong. But at the same time, neither am I. This is what I meant when I said there isn't just one way to play these games, and GT2 is the first game in the series that really highlights this point given the sheer amount of content on offer. So, although on the surface GT1 and GT2 may look extremely similar, hopefully you can now see that they function in many different ways. If I'm being honest, I actually like GT1's layout a bit more. It just seems more well thought out and allows for strategy to come into play in a way that I find more engaging than GT2. However, what GT2's career lacks in coherent structure, it more than makes up for in sheer scope and depth. That's why, although I agree with the common consensus that GT2's career is better, I don't think it's as clear-cut as it might seem. Like I say, it all comes down to which type of experience you really want. But just remember that the ideal Gran Turismo game is one that's truly enjoyable no matter how you decide to play it. I think it's fair to say that, thanks to its prominent glitches, Gran Turismo 2's release wasn't as smooth as the originals. However, in spite of its botched launch, the game was still received really well. As the successor to the greatest racing game of all time, which improved on it in almost every way, it's no surprise that it took over that moniker in many people's eyes. Naturally, given what Polyphony had already proved with the first game, its sequel didn't have quite as much of an impact. All in all, it mainly served as one last hurrah to the original PlayStation. As already mentioned, the PlayStation 2 is by now now on the horizon. In fact, by the time GT2 released, the next Gran Turismo had already been previewed at E3 several months earlier. With this teaser already available, the fact that GT2 was still viewed so positively and still sold really well demonstrated that there was a lot more value to this series than just its technical aspects. It showed that what really mattered was the gameplay experience, something in which GT2 moved the goalposts even further. Using the much heralded original game as a basis to add even more depth and variety, you won't be shocked to hear that GT2 was reviewed extremely well. In the very small portion of mixed reviews, the biggest disappointment was seen to be that, whilst the game expanded on what the original did so well, it didn't add anything entirely new. A fair critique, I believe, but to what degree this actually mattered is subjective. When GT2 released, there were still no other racing games that came close to even GT1, and when some competitors did start emerging, like Sega GT and Driving Emotion Type S, they were noticeably lacking compared to Gran Turismo in most areas. So, whilst it didn't evolve much from GT1, you could argue that at that point, Gran Turismo itself was still being a revolution. So that was the contemporary opinion, but what about in current day? Well, if we consult the poll I created asking my viewers to vote on their personal favourite GT game, we can see that GT2 comes in with about 10% of the total votes. That puts it in 4th place overall, behind GT4, GT5 and GT3. At least these results are consistent with the common opinion that GT2 is a clear improvement over GT1. In fact, it has almost exactly 10 times as many votes. However, what I think is really interesting is the number of comments I got putting together GT2 and GT4 as their favourites for similar reasons. In one sense, this is understandable. In many ways, GT4 is to GT3 what GT2 is to GT1. They each use the previous title, the first on their respective console, as a basis to expand with even more content. At least that's how it appears on a surface level. The exact relation between GT3 and GT4 is a little more complicated, but we'll save that for later. The fact that GT2 seems to fill a similar niche to GT4 in many people's eyes, I believe is one of the reasons why it isn't even more popular. Given that it was seen very positively at the time, and even today you'll find no shortage of people clamoring over it, the fact that it only got 10% of the votes was a little surprising to me. In the past few years, there's been a bit of a movement romanticizing PS1 style graphics. People have started appreciating the visuals of these games in many unique ways, some even going as far to create new games that mirror the same low poly aesthetic. Now I won't lie, these graphics definitely have a certain charm, but at the same time, they also pose a barrier to entry. Whether they want to admit it or not, there are a lot of people who are somewhat put off by these graphics, and I believe this is another factor in why GT2, and by extension GT1, are not more popular in current day. As we'll soon cover, the graphical leap from PS1 to PS2 was enormous, a yawning chasm you could even say. So much so that some games from that era still look decent in current day. For people like me who grew up with the next generation of consoles, we can't remember a time when the latest games looked like this. As relatively early 3D games, they just seem outdated in a way that those on the PS2 and onwards probably never will, even as technology progresses further. Whilst I've always believed that the content and gameplay experience of these games have a much bigger role in making them enjoyable to play, I would be lying if I said that the graphical aspect hasn't slightly affected my perception of GT2. And I know that's also the case for many others from my generation and even younger when looking at these games from a modern standpoint. So with all of that said, what do I personally think makes GT2 worth revisiting in current day? When it came to GT1, you'll remember that I noted its purity, referring to it being the purest vision of what Gran Turismo is based on Kaz's original idea for the series, and how that helps us to contextualize each of the games that come after it. However, for GT2, my answer is nowhere near as esoteric. It's the cars. It wasn't until I started work on this series that I realised something interesting. GT2 has my personal favourite car list of any Gran Turismo game. Now sure, some may think it crazy to rank this roster above the one we got in GT4, that was then gradually added to in GT5 and 6, but for me, GT2's just has a certain something that none of the others do. For example, the absence of the premium European brands was of course seen as a negative back when it came out, but I'd argue that in current day, this has actually resulted in a net positive. Because sure, it's a shame that we can't drive a Ferrari F50 or Lamborghini Diablo, but directly because of that, we can drive Vectors and Venturis, models that never returned to the series and haven't been seen in many racing games since. For me, cars like these add so much to GT2, but it's not just about the exotic stuff. I also really love the selection of normal, everyday vehicles. This is an aspect that pretty much every Gran Turismo game caters for, but I think GT2 does it the best with its wide variety of not just Japanese models, but also contemporary European and American offerings. The sort of stuff that, if you looked out of your window, you would normally see driving on the road back then. As I've said, I wish the career was just balanced a bit better to really incentivize players to use a greater variety of these cars, and the fact that some of them have completely incorrect specs is a shame. But all in all, I still don't think these aspects overshadow just how excellent this car list is. There are just so many weird and wonderful cars that even now, there are still tons of models unique to GT2 that I've never driven, and that's what keeps me coming back to this game more than anything else. As a successor to the original Gran Turismo, GT2 delivered in pretty much every way that it intended to. There was still room for improvement in certain areas, and arguably it didn't add that much to the GT formula. However, what mattered the most is just how much Polyphony learned from making this game, something that will become even more obvious when we look at the games that come after it. But I say that in spite of everything, GT2 holds its own as an excellent entry in this series, and its strong reputation is still just as warranted as its game-changing predecessor.